We are back, yeah.
Okay. Well, we're back, and I'm going to introduce again David Azarewicz, this time with hardware choices for ArcaOS. And this is a brief summary of how ArcaOS runs on various hardware choices and includes some things to look for when selecting a system to run ArcaOS. And I had on the website ArcaOS 5.1, but this is not specific to 5.1. As David pointed out, this is just for ArcaOS. So go ahead, take it away, David.
Hello, I'm David. Let's talk a bit about some of the hardware choices for ArcaOS. Now, this is a very simplified look at the various details involved when you select hardware to run ArcaOS. This is an incredibly complex topic with so many variables that it's really impossible to recommend specific hardware for any particular purpose. But let's see what we can do to help that process. Before we get started talking about the different kinds of hardware, let's review how ArcaOS actually runs on that hardware. This will help you understand why certain things are important when selecting the hardware. It may even help you understand why you're having certain problems with your current hardware. When you turn on the power, the BIOS is running everything. The BIOS sets up the system and initializes some devices like the screen, the keyboard, the disk, whatever. The BIOS then reads the bootloader off the disk and runs it. Eventually the kernel gets loaded and runs. Then the kernel loads device drivers and runs them. As each device driver runs, it takes control of its hardware away from the BIOS. This is the point at which ArcaOS is actually controlling that particular piece of hardware. For example, the keyboard is under BIOS control until all the keyboard drivers are loaded and running. If the BIOS stops doing its job before our drivers are loaded and running, then the keyboard won't work for that short period of time during the boot. This is the reason why on some systems you can't type stuff during the boot process. Eventually, when all the device drivers are up and running, ArcaOS can run independently from the BIOS and no longer needs it. That is, except for a few little things. Like PM Video, that's Presentation Manager Video, windowed and full screen text mode sessions, crash diagnostics and recovery. The first two are just because of the way that OS2 handles video sessions. And the last one is because, well, ArcaOS isn't running anymore when it crashes. So we need some other ways to handle these situations. So in summary, ArcaOS only needs the BIOS to get itself loaded and started, like any OS does. And then it only needs the BIOS for a few little things while it's running. So now let's talk about hardware. And here are some basics. ArcaOS will only run on x86 compatible systems. This may seem obvious to most of us, but it's a question that's come up. Any fairly recent x86 compatible AMD or Intel-based system is fine. That means no 6502s, no 8080s, no 8051s, no ARMs, PowerPCs, Raspberry Pis, M1 Macs, iPads, iPhones, stuff like that. Believe it or not, this is not clear for some people. Other look-alike systems may or may not be compatible, so be careful. It doesn't mean they won't work. Some will, but some won't. Within the x86 architecture, there are three classes of systems that we need to be aware of when choosing a system to run ArcaOS. Each one has its own characteristics and issues. The first is a traditional system with a traditional BIOS. The second is a system that has a UEFI BIOS, but it has a built-in CSM. And the third class is a system that has a UEFI BIOS, but does not have a CSM. I'll explain more about what a CSM is and why it's important a bit later. A Class 1 system, that is the system with a traditional BIOS and a traditional system. This is the kind of system ArcaOS and OS2 was designed to run on. Therefore, by definition, it's going to be the most compatible with everything. The Class 2 system is a system with a UEFI BIOS that also contains an emulation layer called the Compatibility Support Module, or CSM. On this type of system, the CSM is provided by the hardware vendor as part of the BIOS, and it provides an emulation of a traditional system that is mostly complete. There are some issues, of course, with some implementations of the CSM from some vendors. Not all, just some. The problems primarily occur at the low-level video emulation. Remember those few little things that ArcaOS still needs from the BIOS from earlier? Well, this is one of those things. But any version of ArcaOS will run on this type of hardware. Then we've got the Class 3 system, which is a UEFI BIOS system but does not have a CSM in it. For these systems, ArcaOS needs a non-traditional loader to get itself into memory, and then it needs some way to make use of the BIOS services that it needs when they aren't what it expects or when those BIOS services don't exist. So, we built the ArcaNOA compatibility software that provides a special loader and that emulates a limited portion of a traditional system to meet our needs. Now, as far as we know, everything works just fine in this environment, but there still could be some older applications or old drivers out there that need something in the environment that's not emulated. Now, ArcaOS 5.0 will not run on this type of hardware because ArcaOS 5.0 does not contain the ArcaNOA compatibility software. ArcaOS 5.1 is required to run on Class 3 systems with a UEFI BIOS that does not have a CSM. Now, with a limited understanding of the 3 classes of x86 systems available, let's talk about some of the hardware issues and how they relate to each class of systems. Now, ArcaOS and OS2 is a 32-bit operating system. It can only access resources that are addressable with 32-bit addresses. That means any memory or I/O devices which are located above the 4 GB line are not going to be accessible by ArcaOS. Traditional Class 1 systems tended to completely fill, as much as possible, the lower 32-bit portion, the green area, with memory, and they also tended to put all of the I/O devices in that green area, the 32-bit address space. So, with a traditional Class 1 system, you're going to get the most RAM and the most compatibility with ArcaOS. Now, UEFI BIOS with a CSM, that's Class 2 systems, they've started to move some memory into the address space above 4 GB, the yellow area, and thus leaving less memory for 32-bit addresses. This is why you see on these systems having significantly less than 4 GB of RAM available for ArcaOS. These UEFI BIOS systems with a CSM typically put all of the I/O devices into 32-bit address space, the green area, because that makes it easier for their CSM to work. So they're just making it easier on themselves. Now, Class 3 systems, systems that have a UEFI BIOS without a CSM, have started moving more and more memory above that 4 GB line, leaving less and less RAM available for ArcaOS. These systems have also started putting some I/O devices above that 32-bit address line. making these devices unusable for ArcaOS. That's the red area. If certain devices, certain important devices like video or disk or network or other things are not usable by ArcaOS, then ArcaOS is not going to run on those systems. We are looking into a solution that may resolve most of these I/O device situations. It looks very promising, but it's currently unknown how well it will work and whether it will work on all systems. So it needs some more work. So for now, for Class 3 systems, it would be wise to choose systems with required resources located in 32-bit address space. This is not normally a concern for Class 1 and Class 2 systems. And this is what makes Class 2 systems a better choice over Class 3 systems for now, because they are likely to have more RAM available and they're unlikely to have I/O devices out of reach for ArcaOS. Now let's talk about some other hardware selection criteria. Of course, you want to choose an AMD or an Intel CPU. We have found that CPUs from other vendors are not always completely compatible. There are no known problems with any of the current AMD or Intel CPUs. NVIDIA chipsets and NVIDIA controllers can be problematic. NVIDIA chipsets have had known compatibility problems before. And NVIDIA controllers, video controllers, although they work, they historically have not supported the DDC for fetching display information. So, video is generally not going to be an issue. USB is generally not an issue. We have support for OHCI, UHCI, EHCI, and XHCI controllers. Disk and storage is generally not an issue. We've got support for AHCI, NVMe, and IDE disks. LAN is generally not an issue. Most Ethernet chips are supported by the Multimac drivers. Audio is generally not an issue. Most audio controllers are supported by UniAud. Wireless, some are supported by GenMac, and support for others is in development. Other weird stuff like Bluetooth is probably not going to work. So, when you are looking for a new system, try to choose a system with adequate RAM located in 32-bit address space. Also, choose a system with all the required I/O devices in 32-bit address space, and that requirement may be going away in the near future. Try to choose a system with a working DDC and EDID. That's your display characteristics, as in, remember the NVIDIA controllers? Now, this is not fatal if it doesn't work, but things are going to be a lot easier if it does work. Now, notice that the components in the system have nearly no effect on determining if ArcaOS will run on that system or not. It's nearly impossible to determine the suitability of a system for use with ArcaOS by looking at the hardware components. Also, because of that, it should be clear that you cannot determine if the system is going to work by looking at the spec sheet. Almost all problems with computer systems are directly related to the vendor choices in system design or vendor choices with BIOS design. The problems are almost never with what's actually in the system. Before we finish up, let me talk about disks and how that might affect your system choices. Part of choosing a system involves what operating systems you're going to be running and what kind of disk it has in it and how that disk will be partitioned. Generally, if a disk is larger than 2 terabytes, it's going to be GPT. Disks smaller than 2 terabytes can also be GPT-2. The AHCI, NVMe, and USB MSD drivers all have support for these disks, both larger than 2 terabytes and GPT disks. Other drivers than those 3 I mentioned do not. even though the drivers have support for disks larger than 2 terabytes, that doesn't mean you can automatically use them on ArcaOS 5.0 systems. There's more to using disks than just the disk driver. Disks larger than 2 terabytes are typically also going to be GPT. The ArcaOS disk subsystem cannot handle GPT disks, and it cannot handle disks larger than 2 terabytes. Those three drivers, the AHCI, NVMe, and USB MSD drivers, they all detect GPT disks and make them invisible for ArcaOS. They don't make MBR disks invisible, even if they're larger than 2 terabytes. So those disks will be partially accessible, although probably not usable. Now, ArcaOS 5.1 includes a mechanism to be able to use partitions on GPT disks and disks larger than 2 terabytes. So even though you cannot use these big disks on ArcaOS 5.0, you can use them on ArcaOS 5.1. ArcaOS accesses data on GPT disks through an emulation mechanism that makes GPT partitions of up to 2 terabytes look like MBR disks to ArcaOS. This is a great approach because it means that most regular OS2 stuff is just going to work, and it won't even know the difference. So once you have your system set up, it should just work, regardless of what kind of disk or disks you have. So if you choose a system with a big disk, you're going to need ArcaOS 5.1. So also, what software are you going to be running on the system? If you're only going to be running ArcaOS or any other flavor of OS2, your best choice is probably going to be an MBR disk smaller than 2 terabytes. Now, you can use a bigger disk or a GPT disk, but you're going to need ArcaOS 5.1 because it's the one that has the emulator for GPT disk access. If you need to boot non-OS2 operating systems in addition to ArcaOS, your best choice for ease of installation, ease of booting, ease of maintenance is going to be one MBR disk for OS2 and ArcaOS and a separate disk for the other operating systems. Now, these options are not always possible, but these are going to be your optimal choices. You may have a system with only one big disk in it, a laptop for example, and that's okay. It will work just fine with ArcaOS 5.1. In fact, if you want to multi-boot ArcaOS with Linux or even Windows on a single disk, a GPT disk with ArcaOS 5.1 is probably going to be your best choice. So, the big question that everybody's been waiting for the answer to: how do you tell if a particular system can run ArcaOS without actually trying to run ArcaOS on it? And the answer is, you can't. But maybe some of the information presented here today will help somewhat with your system choices. Thank you for watching.
Hi again, David.
Oh, let me turn off my audio here.
Okay.
We don't get echoing. Okay.
Hi again, David. Let's see some of the questions.
I've been kind of watching and answering as they go. Of course, it's much easier for me to see the IRC chat than it is the YouTube chat. But
let me see. On the YouTube chat, there is not much. Oh, there's the question: can you address BIOS settings for running ArcaOS?
I don't know what that means.
The A20 issue.
A20 issue.
Well, the A20 gate issue was only an issue with the installer, and as Lewis said, that has been resolved and will be addressed in the new releases of both 5.07 and any 5.1 release. It was only an installer issue. It wasn't an issue with the operating system itself.
That's good. That's good. And well, the other discussion that you already answered is about NVIDIA. That NVIDIA is quite problematic. You have said it.
Yeah. Yes, NVIDIA has been problematic for quite some time, and that's kind of well known. They're kind of non-standard in the way they do their system controllers, and their video controllers also have never supported the display data channels, so reading the display characteristics. And that kind of means you got to manually set up your display. There's no automatic detection with NVIDIA video controllers.
But in general terms, do we need to keep away any NVIDIA graphic card, or it will work?
Not that I'm aware of. No, they all just seem to work.
So like the basic video output will work and it will be just fine. Of course, we don't have 3D graphics. Yeah.
That's what I've seen so far. Yes, they all just seem to work.
Okay. Let's see. I don't see any more questions. Well, it's a general chat there, but it is asking if we actually use OS2 on modern hardware, and well, the answer is yes. Yeah.
Well, yeah, a lot of us do. I do. It's the only operating system I use for everything. Every day.
Yeah.
All day long.
And yes, yeah. Well, I have noticed that there are different kind of users. There are the legacy users, that the retro computer users that use OS2 on old hardware, but mostly we are like trying to use OS2 on the most modern device we can get, the most modern PC, of course, x86 PC, right? Okay. No, I don't see any more questions. I don't know, Neil, if you saw something that I'm missing.
No, it's just the guy asking, does he use ArcaOS for your computer? And yes, lots of us do.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of us do.
Okay. Yeah. Well, in the IRC chat, Mr. Faulty, well, it's like...
Okay, there we go. Yeah, but it's mostly about the browser, which I think we just can defer to Roderick's session.
Okay.
Yeah, I would do that.
Yeah.
Oh, Lewis wants me to talk a little bit about BIOS settings in USB 3. And
yeah.
when you have the option in your BIOS settings for auto versus USB 2 versus USB 3 modes, it's really going to depend on the particular system. I have found that using auto is generally not the best choice, but it really depends on what that means by the particular BIOS. Sometimes it means, does the BIOS want to try and figure out whether it should use USB 3 for BIOS operations and then turn it off when BIOS operations go away? Or does it mean, should it always be on, or should it never be on? It really depends what the BIOS means by that. In general, I usually just turn it on. To be honest, I usually leave everything exactly as default. And only if I have problems do I go looking and playing with things. And when I have had to play with things, I generally need to turn things from auto to on.
Okay, let's see any more questions. Huh?
No, people just commenting about using ArcaOS.
Yeah, yeah. No,
A lot of us do. It's a really lightweight, fast system. It's really quite a bit more efficient to use for me than other things I've tried.
Well, now on the IRC, well, Mr. Faulty says that there has been a very good progress, and I think he says that we can prepare now our Santa's list for the next
Santa
versions.
list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's looking very good. The progress is very looking good to finally get OS2 to the current hardware, to the modern hardware, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking, in the back of my mind, I've been thinking about writing a little app that would analyze the system and give you red or green, will it work or will it won't work? And maybe I could write something like that and put it on the installation medium so that you could just boot the installer and it could tell you whether the system will work or not. I'll have to think about that. Because you really don't know. You can't tell from the specs because we can support pretty much all the adapters, all the drivers and things will work on all the devices. But what you really can't tell is how the vendors configured the system, and that you can only tell by running some software on it. And I don't know. I'll think about it. That would certainly make things a lot easier.
Yeah, you're right about that. When you are on the store or you buy a computer online, there's no way you can know which component, which chipset, which hardware IDs does the device has inside. You have to run PCI.x,
yeah.
and nobody writes it and put it on the product
documentation. No, they
yet.
don't. They'll tell you what chipset's in it, maybe. But even knowing which devices are in it, it doesn't matter that much because we can run almost everything except for Wi-Fi, but that's going to be changing. But what you cannot tell is how the vendor has set it up. Like, for example, how it's configured the various things and where it's put them in memory. And that's the kind of things that we need to check for.
Okay.
So maybe I'll think about writing that.
That will be great. Just let us know and we will try it out. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, well, there is a question about reporting hardware, or if there can be like some method for ArcaOS, I guess in general, so users can report hardware.
Well, that's an idea.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea to try to consolidate what users are working with and find out what is working and what not. Well, based on the experience of some users, well, that's a good idea. Okay. That's all I see. I don't know, Neil, if you see something else.
No, I think, if you want to have an up-to-date wiki, it would be nice to have an automatic method of doing it, because a lot of people's idea about what hardware they've got is wrong. And it would be nice to have a program to just zip that up and send it up, much like test log.
Yeah. Well, it's some ideas, but we'll take it under consideration. It can be a huge maintenance nightmare maintaining something like that. So
yes,
we'll give it some consideration.
Does IBM use ArcaOS? Yeah.
Actually, I think they do.
Well, I guess that is a question for Louis.
He answered it.
Oh, yeah. In fact, IBM is a client of ours. Yeah? Okay, good.
Yeah. How's that? That's going full circle on them.
All right.
Okay, I think we're done with the questions, and well, so let's go a little into standby mode for a little while.
Okay.
And we will continue with Neil, right?
With Roderick.
Roderick, no, yeah, Roderick. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I have the schedule here. Yeah, we will continue with Roderick. Roderick is ready, but it's too early, and we need to respect the schedule, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
We might move John Edwards up if you, I don't know. Because
Okay.
otherwise he just has closing remarks. It might just be good to go straight to them from Lewis's presentation. All right.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks.